Hi, welcome to 10 by 6, Sally Davidson.
Hi, Tom.
Hi, lovely to see you, and thanks ever so much for joining us. Um, so, obviously a lot has happened in relation to climate change, COP26, and activism and protests around that recently over the last couple of weeks. But before that, we had the United Nations IPCC report, which was a very important and quite shocking sort of document. So I wanted to start the interview with you by just asking you, if you could, to share what some of the main, just to summarize what some of the main findings in that IPCC report were.
Yeah, sure. So since I kind of became acutely aware of like the climate science of the climate crisis, there's been two IPCC reports. So the first one was in 2018, and that set out that we had 12 years to prevent the kind of irreversible climate change happening, which basically meant like if we don't sort it out in 12 years, that stuff, tipping points would happen in our natural systems. Like that sounds kind of removed from like our supermarkets and our daily experience, but that is like essentially the water and the heat that grows our food that we can eat, that things would start changing and we wouldn't be able to do anything. So it would become acutely aware like that we are, in a dangerous position, and actually by that time it would be impossible to reverse it. Since then, I think the next report came out kind of in the autumn of this year, and that is scientists from across the world. Like they do work for governments, so they often tend to be like a lot more conservative than potentially like retired scientists or people working in other kind of spheres. So we have the conservative governments, like in terms of their sort of predictions, now telling us in 2021, just 3 years later from that first report, or the 12 years report, that it's now code red for humanity, and also making the link that this is, it's unequivocal that humans, our sort of carbon heavy lifestyle of, the last couple of 100 years, but particularly like our carbon emissions, I know in the UK grow year on year, have essentially caused this climate crisis. So, people who would like to say that, the climate has always changed, like, yeah, that is true, but not in this, such a speedy way. So yeah, it's connected to humans, it's connected to how we're living our lives, it's connected to how our governments are kind of, structuring our societies. And we are actually at a point where it's code red, it's almost game over. And this year as well, like one of the, I think he's from the Environment Agency, Sir James Bevan, actually said that in the UK already we are seeing worst case scenarios. So like the flooding that we've seen, so even the scientists, what they were predicting, we're already in 2021 seeing the worst case of those predictions. So yeah, it's like really, really scary what's coming out from the science papers. There was also the Chatham House report, which anyone who's like listening and kind of interested to like dig a bit more into the science, like just read the summary. It's really, really petrifying, and it's amazing that it's not on the 6 o'clock news like every night, in terms of where by the end of the century where we could be. So yeah, there's lots of really alarming science out there, but it is causing, it's calling people into action, which is what we've seen in the last couple of years.
Absolutely. And just so people know, a lot of the discussion is about degrees Celsius above, or if you like centigrade, above what's called pre-industrial levels, and there's discussion of 1.5 degree rise from pre-industrial levels, 2 or more, and what that might mean. And of course, as a layperson who doesn't really explore the detailed science and what those increases mean, to a layperson you might think, oh, I wouldn't mind the temperature being 1.5 degrees more, a little bit warmer, it would be like living in the south of France. But of course, those small, in fact, fractions of a degree temperature rises cause massive changes to the global climate and our ecosystem. Could you just share a little bit just about the kind of things that the scientists are warning of in terms of climate change? What by the end of the century, what kind of things could happen, Sal?
Yeah, sure, Tom. So I know it's sort of, you hear a lot about like 2 degrees C and the Paris Accord Agreement, which was several years ago. I think it was 2015 now, and which was 1.5. And these do feel like really like almost insignificant numbers, like they're so low. And I found out recently that, and I would consider myself a layperson, right? Like I'm not a scientist, but I've connected with like the trauma that's ahead, and I've kind of felt called into a space of like, I'm not gonna, knowing what is ahead, I can't stand by and do nothing at this stage or turn away. But yeah, I found out recently that actually the way that they take the global average sort of temperature rise is sea and land. So that 1.5 encompasses like the deepest ocean temperatures as well as like the land temperatures. So actually, I think it's 2 degrees. What that means as a land average is 7. So suddenly, if you live in like what is already a hot country, you know, like close to the equator, think of places like Baghdad, think of Africa, a 7-degree shift is huge. And even for, you know, for us in the UK, like in the last few years, I didn't grow up hearing about wildfires in the United Kingdom. And in the last couple of years alone, there's been huge like wildfires that have been getting out of control because the ground is so dry, because we don't have rain when we have usually had rain. And the second part of your question, Tom, around what scientists are predicting, like when I first became aware, sort of like, you know, I grew up in quite a green household, like my mum recycled, and as kids we went to bottle banks and stuff, so we did kind of live in a, you know, possibly like a slightly more like frugal environmental way, but when I came like really acutely aware in 2018 of how like serious the kind of carbon emission global temperature rise was, one of the statistics that I heard that really connected with me was that I think it was within the next 70 years, so well within this century, it was predicted that 1 in 9 people globally would be on the move. And I sort of, previous to this, I have done some voluntary work with refugees, like in France and in Greece. And I've heard the stories and the horror and the, you know, exploitation of women and young people and the kind of, yeah, all that sort of horrible time in our history, but is very, very real if you're displaced from your home and governments aren't kind of coming to your aid. And so that just to me was like, wow, in my adult lifetime, I've seen a really small migration of people from Syria, like into Europe. And I've noticed that, you know, the rise of kind of fascism and nationalism when, you know, when people are small, relatively, I think, I'm not sure how many millions it was, but it wasn't massive. And how, you know, you could even link that to Brexit, like whichever side you sit on, like we've had a lot of kind of unsettled politics around that and unrest. And I just thought 1 in 9 people, you know, well within children's lifetimes that are alive now, like I can't even imagine what that will do to like borders and nations and food security and, you know, healthcare and all of these things that we rely on. And yeah, just kind of deeply connected to the fear of that, really, based on my experience of, yeah, sort of witnessing as a fully kind of conscious adult watching the news, and also then going to volunteer with refugees. It's not something I would wish on anyone. And yeah, that is
1 in 9 of the global population would be over 750 million people.
Yeah,
could be on the move, forced into being a refugee due to climate change, crop failures, extreme weather events, floods, fires, massive failures of crops, and the wars that will inevitably ensue due to lack of resources and food and clean water and etc. So yeah, pretty scary dystopian vision of the future unless we act in a big way now. Yeah,
and I would say unless our governments act, like we, you know, this is way past like the individual realm, like we need like governments to have the political will to really sort this out, and whether that's legislation or whether that's like radical kind of like rethinking of our society and how we consume and how we travel, and you know, I think. And yeah, a lot of the work that I've been doing is definitely directed at government, as opposed to like trying to encourage people to like pick up litter or like, you know, recycle or go vegan. It's like all of these things are really good and noble, but essentially we do need governments to be acting at this moment. It's so crucial.
Yes, and as you say, those individual actions are really important and contribute to the overall effect of positive changes. But it is the burning of fossil fuels and the decisions made by government right now about the use of fossil fuels, continued burning of them or not, which is the critical aspect. Yeah, yeah. Well, let's talk a bit about COP26. So it was held in the UK this year, up in Glasgow. We hosted it. Let me just ask you, could you share with us what you think was needed? What kind of actions would have constituted a successful COP26 as a bare minimum, and what we actually got and what the difference between the two is?
So what we needed from COP26, and I would say from the previous 26 or 25 COPs that have happened successively, is that we needed them to ensure that we have a safe future. That hasn't happened, as I understand from what I've read. It wasn't even on the table of this discussion, and that can, you know, in a cynical view, that can show you the power that actually corporate interest has in these, you know, types of scientific conference. Like, there's 3 different types of COP that happen. One is on biodiversity, one is on desertification, and this is the one which is very much around climate policy. And it's no surprise that this is also the one that has, you know, the most money invested and the most lobbying. So yeah, I'm not going to say that they weren't doing their best, but basically what they were negotiating for, which they didn't get, was also wholly inadequate. So COP has massively failed, like, despite everyone's best intentions. What we need is like radical action to cut carbon emissions, and we also need the restoration of ecology. So that is the best sources that we have, the best technology that we have, which we've had as long as the Earth has existed, are trees that take carbon out of the atmosphere. And in the UK, I know specifically we have peat bogs that also do the same. So the like 2 things that we could start, like, you know, radically need to be done well, need to be done with care, of course. Like, you know, biodiversity, restoring woodlands is like not an easy task, but it is possible. And there's like 2 things that don't rely on any technology that, you know, that could happen straight away. And, you know, through the sort of environmental awareness, like, work that I've done, like, I've become aware of projects like HS2, which is like something like the biggest destruction of ancient woodlands in this country since like the war effort. And I don't even think it was like World War II. I think it was like more, you know, more further back in our history than that. So it just kind of, you know, we have governments sort of collectively around the world, some, you know, more than others, who are kind of giving lip service to the emergency, which now 70% of the UK population are concerned about climate change. Like, that is massive in the last few years. And we have governments that are doing lip service to kind of taking it seriously, whilst every year our carbon emissions go up. So yeah, like, what we needed from COP was to ensure that our children will have food to eat in 30 years and they'll have an NHS, and that, you know, what we tell them, like, get a job, buy a house, like, get a pension, like, that's all meaningful. And like, at the moment, it's not at all.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks for that. It was obviously very disappointing COP, and you know, and I know that afterwards the scientists have crunched the numbers and sort of said that even if all the pledges are made, which they traditionally have not been, you know, they're traditionally all the pledges made at COP get broken by a whole load of countries, including us. But even if all the pledges that were made at COP26 were kept to, we're still looking at, you know, way off the targets we need to set in terms of reducing emissions and cutting global warming. So, and that's leaving a legacy for our children and grandchildren, which is going to be catastrophic and devastating. So when the scientists are saying that, you know, the public have got to sit up and listen, even if the politicians won't. And that brings me on a bit to your own activism. You, along with a lot of people in this country, have seen the need, almost the obligation, to, on behalf of future generations, really, to try to raise these issues and fight for action, fight for the right actions to be taken by our politicians. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your own sort of climate activism, the kind of things you've done over the last few years. Sort of what have you done and why have you done it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tom. So I spoke briefly earlier, like, after the first IPCC report that I became aware of in 2018, which set out this very clear time frame of like 12 years to, you know, prevent irreversible effect of climate change, I first kind of became active in Extinction Rebellion. And I, you know, yeah, as I said, I was fairly green. I thought, you know, I tried to make good decisions. I, you know, felt good about myself when I was recycling and, you know, trying to buy less plastic, but was actually, when I look back, like feeling quite bad about what I felt like I couldn't change, like going to the supermarket and going, oh, like putting stuff in the bin and feeling like really guilty a lot of the time, or maybe going with friends like to Europe for the weekend and flying and thinking like, I know this is terrible, but I'm like, you know, what do I do? And I sort of went along to an Extinction Rebellion demonstration that was happening, which was an act of civil disobedience, which means, you know, kind of putting the government and police in a dilemma. It's like, we are technically breaking the law, but like, are you going to allow it as a kind of peaceful protest, or are you going to arrest us? And kind of highlight, yeah, sort of that there's an injustice, or give attention to the cause, or however you want to kind of see that works. And it was really, really powerful. Like I'd been on marches for various kind of moments in time. But I'd never been in a kind of like sit-in demonstration. And, you know, I'd never interacted with the police and in any kind of, you know, big way. And I really saw the power of people coming together and having conversations. And actually, for the first time in probably the few years that had, you know, preceded that, felt like confident and positive about what I could do. Like it felt meaningful to be taking a stand to say like, actually this isn't all right with me, and like I don't know what else I can do. And I then became involved with Extinction Rebellion in my local area and learned loads more about climate science and solutions, and you know, the sort of how things have changed over history. So like looking at the suffragettes, looking at the civil rights, like these huge moments in time when something wasn't right, you know, it was killing people or huge injustices were happening, and people took action that wasn't kind of led by government, or wasn't kind of the usual process of, you know, we go and vote every 4 years, or we you know, do sort of like traditional campaigning like petitions or lobbying or things like that, and realized that actually there is a real way that you can make change in times of emergency or times when it's needed, and it's really different to like how I was living my life before. Like, but you can say no, and one of the ways that you do that is by breaking what are often very sort of low level laws that we have, like such as obstruction of the highway, and you're doing that to kind of like disrupt business as usual. So like to the members of public that witness it, like they're understanding that like, something big is happening. And unfortunately, I don't know, it's kind of uncomfortable disrupting the general public, but it does get the journalists talking about it, and it does get, as we saw with Extinction Rebellion, it does get a kind of shift or sort of more awareness in the general public, which then the government will respond to. Like after the kind of biggest demonstration that XR held in 2019, the government a few weeks later declared, I think it was like the next week, declared a climate emergency. So you can see this relationship between like people taking disruptive action and the government kind of responding with something. And so, yeah, I kind of really saw this power and the great need that I had as somebody who wanted to live myself in a moral way, that I needed to do more than I was doing. And this was a route that I could feel like that was meaningful. At the time I was also training to be a teacher, so that was in a primary school, so that was really interesting and really, really fulfilling and like a wonderful experience. And but I was also kind of with the people that are going to be affected the worst, and who certainly don't get a vote and they don't get much kind of voice in society. So I was having this really kind of like dual experience of like being in primary school, and then on the weekends like potentially going and breaking the law as part of Extinction Rebellion. And sort of after I'd finished my training, I decided that I would try and take a year out, and I kind of was able to set myself up financially to do that, which is a real privilege. So yeah, I think part of it is like, I think particularly people with privilege, and so often that might be people who are retired or people who have less kind of drain on their like day-to-day resources really need to step up and fill this space. So yeah, that's kind of how I became like a full-time active member of society, or activist or volunteer, or yeah, however you want to describe it. And yeah, it's been like an incredibly meaningful time, I think. And there's also something about kind of like looking at the darkness that what is ahead, and it kind of really forcing you into the present of like, one, a space of hope that actually something can be done, it's not like too late yet, but also kind of living, I don't know, it feels to me like living well. So yeah.
I mean, I guess we would all like to live our lives in a way which leaves the world a better place than we found it, or that where we contribute something to the you know, to the world. And you know, I think you've been doing that, and a shining example to all. During the course of that answer, you answered one of my potential questions, which was a lot of people, of course, say, well, I agree with, you know, Extinction Rebellion, I agree with Insulate Britain, I agree with what they're saying, these protesters, but I don't agree with their methods. And I think you answered that question there by saying, you know, we've written, people have written emails and written to their MPs and written to their newspapers and signed petitions and lobbied and things as ordinary people for decades now about the issues of climate, the environment and climate change. And the politicians have completely ignored all of those methods. Now it's really urgent, it's serious. The future of the planet and humankind and thousands of other species are at risk, threatened in a dire way. And the action you're taking is raising awareness. You know, it's been covered by the media, so it's therefore raising awareness with the public. And also, it can't be ignored by politicians, and it has led to politicians declaring a climate emergency, etc. So I think hopefully that would answer people that say that, you know, that say they don't agree with the methods. These methods are now what's required. It's the only answer that's left, I think. I wanted to just move on then and talk about the Highway 9. So people that we know were 9 people were arrested, excuse me, and last week for climate activism, blocking a highway or partially blocking a highway or motorway, and last week they were sentenced. There were 9 of them. They were each of them sentenced for between 3 and 6 months, 3 months, 4 months, or 6 months that each of them received in prison. Quite obviously shocking and harsh sentences, and that's led to a huge response from the public, not just people that have been involved with climate activism the last few years, but just ordinary members of the public who have seen that as appalling, and you know, almost fascistic way for our government and our judicial system to be treating these people. So this weekend has seen a huge number of people take to the streets, take part in protests against the incarceration of the Highway 9, as they're known. I just wanted to ask you your views on the Highway 9, what they did, the sentences they've received, and the response to that.
Yeah, sure. So the 9 were the sort of first group of at least 34 people were part of the Insulate Britain campaign of non-violent civil resistance, who were, maybe some of them several times, have broken these injunctions that were sought initially by the Highways England, like say the people who do like most of the strategic road network and motorways in England, and then later by Transport for London, who are kind of caretakers of all the road network in London. And I mean, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a bizarre approach actually to get this sort of injunction, you know, to use the injunctions to prevent protest. Like, it's actually, you know, it's caught in its net far more groups than just Insulate Britain. So it is a really kind of big, quite overreach step, and it was massively kind of encouraged by Grant Shapps, who's our transport minister. So this kind of, I don't know, the fact that there's not supposed to be like deep connection between like government and the judiciary, like, is kind of seen in the way that this story of Insulate Britain has panned out. You know, we have laws that prevent roads from being blocked, and those could have been used. But yeah, potentially they wanted to have some sort of greater sanctions, so they went down a kind of injunction route. In terms of like the sentences, I sort of, yeah, I think it shows the political will of our government, really. Like, and I think there's been links that the judge has like really deep family links to like some people who are kind of high up in big fossil fuel companies, which is probably really common. Like, you know, that's the wealthiest people in our country are probably going to be in the judiciary, and they're also probably going to be, you know, connected to the wealthy industries, which happen to be quite, you know, really destructive. So yeah, I mean, I think that the 9 people, as you know, the 34 people or the sort of 20 or so that are likely to follow them, like, I think they were prepared to have that kind of consequence with what they were doing. And I think they're really, really supported. So that kind of helps me. You know, lots of people go to prison who don't have that support network. So all that kind of privilege, you know, to kind of, yeah, have access to money that you need while you're in there, and people writing to you and stuff. So
and
yeah.
Can I just say that sorry, Sally, can I just say you have experience of this yourself, in that you served a term yourself. You were sentenced yourself. Was it last year or so?
Yeah, so I spent a really short time. It was just a week. I was sentenced to 14 days. And that was because I took part in a protest which happened in a courtroom. And it was a magistrate's court, so it wasn't like the high court, like the court that sentenced the 9. But yeah, I mean, it sort of seems weird, and it's uncomparable to somebody who's like had a very different life experience and gets like a couple of year sentence, which is really common, sadly, in this country, with very little support, like before, during, or after when they leave. But yeah, like as someone who supported it, I felt like it for such a short time it was doable. And what you kind of referenced is what we've seen is that actually when people connect to the sacrifice that these 9, you know, soon to be 34 people are prepared to make, and there's a kind of real vulnerability about, like, it's kind of the worst thing that, you know, supposedly the worst thing that can happen to you in our society is you have your liberty taken away, that people really are moved by that, and that there's a kind of they call it a backfire, which is a bit of jargon, but it means that actually it has the opposite effect. So, you know, the authorities have imprisoned these people to kind of make an example of them, but actually what happens, like you were saying, is the next day that there's lots of public sympathy saying that this doesn't feel right. Like, these people are, you know, I might not agree with them, but they're trying to do good. I can see that in what they're trying to do, and to imprison people as like political prisoners, you know, yeah, resonates with the public. And, you know, other people who are kind of more active and feel able to ended up kind of holding a much bigger demonstration in London over the weekend, and I think there were 124 arrests in total. So yeah, you kind of see this like call to action happen when there is kind of overreach from the government. And the mad thing is, Tom, is like they could just agree to insulate homes, and that would like benefit millions of families living in fuel poverty like this winter. And so yeah, when I say that like reveals the political agenda, it's like there's so much our government could be doing, and those 9 people are encouraging them to like do better for the people of this country. And you know, they've taken a choice which isn't the choice that's going to help long term, and it isn't going to help people living in cold homes this year. But yeah, and they've made a choice to imprison them instead.
I think I'm right in saying about 8,000 people died last winter from you know, fuel poverty, and you know, from the cold, from hypothermia, mostly our elderly. But you know, there are also kids growing up in cold and damp premises. Families can't afford to you know, to have heating, etc. So yeah, I mean, it's not just a climate change issue; it's an issue of people and people's health, and people dying when they needn't be dying.
Definitely. And like, you know, think of it, I think there was a shelter report that came out that 1 in 5 people are made sick by their home because it's damp and cold. So it's also like, you know, more money for the NHS if these, you know, not only is their quality of life much better if you don't get sick, like it's more money for nurses, like potentially, like it's, you know, more resources. And yeah, there's just so many things, and also like I hear a lot about kind of renewables, and that, you know, at the moment we can't generate in the UK like enough solar and wind, which is like valid. Yeah, we can't. So instead of going into kind of like nuclear and, or, you know, reliant on fossil fuels, which we are, like, how about we use less? And so it's like, well, actually, I think there's something like an 80% reduction in people's energy bills. It might even be more, would happen if their homes were properly insulated. So it's like, well, you know, there's so many kind of solutions available to kind of, yeah, help people right now living in fuel poverty, but also to drastically lower our fuel bills and our carbon emissions. And our government's failing to do that. There was like a heat and building strategy that came out a couple of months ago, and they're talking about like heat pumps, which is like something that definitely needs to happen, but they're like investing all this money in heat pumps without insulating people's homes. It's like, I think somebody said it's like sending someone to war with a gun and no bullets. It's just like meaningless. So yeah,
absolutely crazy. One of the issues, of course, is that our parliamentary system, or our electoral system, you know, with elections every 4 to 5 years, let's say, it's so politicians, whoever's in government in this country, tends to think long term. Other electoral systems, other systems of government are more about coalitions, and they are therefore able to think more long term. They might, you know, governments might be able to plan 15, 20 years ahead, whereas our government tends to think in 4 to 5 year cycles, and what will make us still be really, really popular in 4 or 5 years when it comes to the next election. So they don't want to spend money now that will benefit us over 20 years. They just want to take measures, you know, not spend money now and take measures that will just keep them popular in the short term, which is, we can't afford politicians to take that approach. In fact, we can't afford our electoral system that we have here. The planet can't afford politicians that only think in 3 or 4 years ahead how popular they're going to be. We just can't afford that anymore. Yeah, well, thanks. Well, I mean, on behalf of 10 by 6 and Dorset Eye, we send obviously our thanks and our best wishes to the climate activists that are currently incarcerated or facing such sentences in the near future. And, you know, nine arrests led to 124 arrests. You know, arresting people and sticking them in prison isn't the answer. You know, soon there's going to be 1,000, then there'll be 10,000 people on the streets, then there'll be 100,000 people on the streets. Then all the young people will leave their schools and say, we demand action. We're not returning to school till there's action. The government can't arrest everyone and stick them in prison. They're going to have to change. And I think, you know, people power is going to force them. And, you know, I hope anybody that's watching this and feels stirred to take some action. I'm not advocating, you know, obviously I can't advocate people to break the law or get themselves in trouble, but I hope everyone can do something, even if it's just talking to your friends, your family, your neighbours, to make them aware of how important, how serious this crisis is. Before we finish, I just wanted to, if I may, just ask you a couple of quick ones. One is that you hear people very often say, there's not much point me doing anything or this country doing anything, because the big polluters who need to take action is China and India, and of course whilst they're not doing nearly enough, why should we? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so this comes up quite a lot, and I don't know, there's a kind of simple analogy that helps me to like figure out like why that doesn't make much sense to me personally, which is like, we're in an emergency situation, and like, say if you were in a boat that was sinking and there were 10 people there representing the different countries of the world, like or the developed nations, like you wouldn't have a discussion about like who was going to do what and how much and when. You would just start bailing water. So yeah, like we're in a situation where we just need to start bailing water. Like we just need to restore our ecology, and we need to lower our carbon emissions. And like so who knows?
Said you know the house is on fire. You call the fire brigade, you put the fire out, you know, the world is on fire, the house is on fire. That's how we need to do it. Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely. Sorry, Sally, and it's like, you know, who knows what will happen in those countries, but we're, as a British citizen, like I'm responsible for what happens here. So like, and so are our government. So yeah, who knows, you know, Britain has led the world, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And potentially we could be doing that again if we just need some leadership from our government. Yeah.
And I mean, I read there's also of course, China and India are huge polluters, huge contributors to carbon emissions, because they have enormous populations, apart from anything else, and industrial, large industries, etc. So of course they do, but per capita, per head of population, the UK and other, rich and developed nations are actually far more, per person, we contribute far more to global warming than people living in the poorer countries. So yeah, no, very good answer and a good way to think of it, Sally. So my last question to you is just, I wonder what you think of the propaganda that we hear from politicians. We had when he was President Trump, ex-President Trump, sorry, I'm going to say ex-disgraced President Trump, talked about clean coal, the idea of clean coal. He never said coal, he always said clean coal, lovely clean coal. And we've heard very similar things from Morrison, the Prime Minister of Australia, pretty much the biggest producer of coal in the world. And we even hear of phrases used by our UK politicians recently, like even cleaner fossil fuels. We're going to create even cleaner fossil fuels. How do you think about politicians using phrases like those?
Yeah, I was reminded of President Trump thinking that like we shouldn't, or suggesting we should inject bleach like during the start of the pandemic or whatever it was. And just thinking like, yeah, like why? Yeah, definitely has some like absolutely dangerous suggestions for the planet. Which yeah, his sort of clean coal is probably one of those too. I think what we've seen, and I kind of referenced it earlier, is that that politicians are increasingly aware that it's getting really, really obvious. Like we had heat waves in Canada killing hundreds of people. We had floods in Germany. We've had floods in this country, in London. And so they're kind of paying lip service to say like, we can, yeah, we're doing loads and we can, it's PR. And like I'm kind of reminded of, and this is something I kind of found out in the last couple of years, which was that the phrase carbon footprint actually was a PR slogan that BP, so like one of the biggest oil companies, paid for and created and then publicized. And that's huge. It's like they realize, the companies that have been doing this destruction had the science like back in the 70s, and they chose to continue to extract and sell and burn fossil fuel. And back in, I think it was like the early 2000s, they said like, shit, like we need to like make sure that people don't think this is our fault. And so they shifted it away from powerful institutions, away from responsible corporations, onto the general public to say it's about your carbon footprint. Like you need to do, you need to live a different way, which is total nonsense. And that's like why we are where we are. And if Tom, just before we finish, like if I could just say like one thing is like, I think, I don't know, the kind of the things that I have done as part of groups in the last couple of years, like kind of give you some sort of status or kudos. And I just want to really acknowledge that like I'm a totally regular person, but I connected with what was ahead. And I felt like I could do something. And so, yeah, I'm just sort of like encouraging anyone who is watching this, like if you kind of can, I don't know, if you have space in your life to do something and to kind of risk your liberty, or maybe, I don't know, your career or whatever is like holding you into a system of obedience. Like if you maybe don't have children, but have like nieces and nephews and want to see them to have like a safe future, like I really call you to like explore and to think about what you could do this year. Like the one of the former scientific advisors from the government said this year that the next 3 to 4 years will determine the future of humanity. And this is like, I know you said earlier, like grandchildren, like we're talking about like my life is affected. Like I would like to have a child. I'm in my 30s, and knowing what I know, I don't think it's safe for me to do that. Or, it doesn't feel like responsible to me. And that's no judgment on anyone else, but yeah, I would just call people watching this to assess in 10 years and 20 years time, like will they look back on this year and think they like did all they could? And I said before, like I found this a really meaningful way to live. And I would encourage you, if you have the privilege, whether it's like resource, whether it's time, whether it's like not having dependence, like come on, like we really need you at this great moment.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great thing to end on, and it reminded me of, I can't remember it exactly, so I'll paraphrase it, but the great Margaret Mead said something along the lines of never underestimate you know, the fact that a few ordinary people can change the world. And that's always been the case, that, you know, a lot of the biggest changes in the world have been instigated by ordinary people getting together and you know, and fighting for positive change. So and before we finish, you know, I want to thank you again for your activism, for taking time from your you know, your career and your life to fight for a future for our children, our grandchildren, thousands of species of animals, you know, who are in danger now. So thank you for what you've been doing, Sally. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Very, very informative and enlightening. Hope our viewers have enjoyed it and learned something from it and perhaps feel inspired. So thanks again, Sally, and hopefully we'll speak to you again in the future.
Cheers, Tom. Lots of love for all you do
Thanks, you
too.
too. Bye.
Bye.